Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. As the last election result showed, in absolutely no uncertain terms, Australians are no fools when it comes to knowing the economic management of this country could not be in better hands than those of the coalition government. The intelligence and intuition of Australians could only be insulted by any suggestion that somehow they got it wrong by making sure Prime Minister Morrison and Treasurer Frydenberg continue to command the nation's economic shift. And it's about time those opposite showed some respect to those Australians and the fact they got it right. With 1/3 of the budget spent on welfare and the usual cries and intellectually bereft suggestions that the Newstart allowance should be raised simply ignores the fair way in which the Morrison government is managing welfare payments with the highest standards of fiscal responsibility, while retaining the sensitivity needed to support those in hardship. The Morrison government's extremely sensitive to the pressing needs of Australians doing it tough, and as I've said previously, any suggestion to the contrary is pure mischief. But once again, it's time to correct the public record of our welfare commitments and focus on the facts. Once again, it's necessary to highlight that the Newstart rate increases every 6 months. It's boosted in accordance with CPI. And please take note of this, and perhaps you might want to all write it down using indelible ink. 99% of recipients receive additional payments. Newstart will always be increased by indexation, and that's not going to change. Labor knows full well the recipients are not just receiving Newstart. They know that rental assistance and other measures are also supporting people in challenging circumstances as they seek employment. They know Newstart and youth allowance are often supplemented by a fortnightly energy payment, rental assistance payments. 19% of unemployed people receive family payments, and that's just for starters. The Morrison government remains committed to focusing on the key issue, something you might want to have a really good listen to, Senator Pratt. We're actually focused on the key issue of securing employment. And just look at the Morrison government's recent record on job. Makes for fantastic reading. Employment grew by 1.9% through the year to January 2020, almost double the OECD average, and compares to just 0.7% when we came to office. The last 3 months of jobs data have beaten median market expectations with around 800,000. I'll say it again for you. 800,000 jobs created. On average, over the past 12 months, a record 74.5% of the population aged 15 to 64 had a job, which the RBA governor said was, and I quote, fantastic. More people in jobs and fewer people on welfare, pushing welfare dependency to its lowest level in 30 years, with 100,000 fewer people of working age people on welfare over the past year. The December quartile retail trade volumes increased by 0.5%, beating median market expectations, and the fastest increase since the June quarter 2018. This followed the largest increase in household disposable income in a decade in the September quarter 2019, following the government's low and middle income tax offsets, putting money back into the pockets of Australians, which boosted income by $4.5 billion in the quarter. December also saw a trade surplus for a record 24 consecutive months, bringing the trade balance to $67.6 billion in 2019, a record high. The housing market continues to strengthen, with house prices up 5.2% over the year. The value of new housing loans up by 14% over the year to December 2019, the biggest increase in almost 3 years and above market expectations. And building approvals also up by 2.7% over the year, with the RBA expecting residential construction to support activity by the end of this year. The number of owner-occupied loan commitments to first home buyers increased by 6.2% in December to be 21.3% higher through the year. First home buyers now make up 34.9% of total owner-occupier loans, well above the 10-year average. On February 7th, the RBA governor noted, again quoting, loan arrear rates is coming down. the number of people who have problems with their personal debt is coming down. So it looks like, across a range of dimensions, balance sheets are in a better position. This improvement is supported by the introduction of the government's low and middle income tax offset, with more than $6 billion already paid out to more than 8 million taxpayers. And then there is the impressive wage growth. It's expected to gradually pick up across the forward estimates, supported by ongoing employment growth. Wages, as measured by the Wage Price Index, rose by 2.2% through the year in the December quarter. Real wages grew by 0.4% through the year to December quarter, slightly lower than the 20-year average. However, over the past 10 years, growth in the WPI has usually outpaced CPI. Compensations of employees was 5% through the year's terms in the September quarter, compared to with 3.5% in the September quarter 2013. In Australia, as in other advanced economies, the response of wages to improving labour market conditions has been slower and more muted than in past cycles, but this is partly explained by lower inflation expectations and spare capacity in the labour market, as indicated by broader measures of labour underutilisation. Strong employment growth has also drawn people into the labour market who were not previously looking for work. Going forward, wage growth will be supported by the key drivers of wages: spare capacity in the labour market, inflation, and labour productivity. Spare capacity in the labour market is being reduced, with employment increasing by 247,400 people during the 12 months to January 2020. Inflation is likely to pick up and be within the RBA's target band by the June quarter 2021. Wage growth is expected to pick up through the year terms to 2.5% to the June quarter 2020 and the June quarter 2021. In the projection years, wage growth is projected to pick up to be a further 2.75% in 21-22 and 3% 22-23 as spare capacity is reduced. The WPI grew by 2.2% through the year to the December quarter 2019, up from 1.9% through the year to the June quarter 2017. Average earnings on a national accounts basis, another measure of wage growth, which is calculated as a total compensation of employees divided by total employees, increased by 0.7% in the September quarter 2019 to be 2.9% higher through the year. Total compensation of employees increased by 1.1% in the September quarter to be 5% higher through the year, and total company profits increased by 1.7% to 11.1% higher through the year. Spare capacity in the labour market is an important factor in influencing wage growth, as are consumer price developments. The unemployment rate was 5.3% in January 2020, down from a recent peak, 6.4% in October 2014. In the December quarter, the trend means CPI, a measure of underlying inflation, increased by 0.4% to be 1.6% higher through the year. And I realise there's a lot of numbers here, but I hope, particularly for Senator O'Neill's sake, that she's taking a great deal of note of them. The mid-year economic and fiscal outlook forecasts for wage growth are consistent with the broad consensus amongst economists for a pickup in wage growth, and Treasury's projections of economic parameters, including wage growth, from 21-22 onwards, are determined by medium-term methodology introduced in the 14-15 budgets. But wait, the economic measures of living standards provide even more encouraging news. Household disposable income, as measured by the ABS in the national accounts, increased 5.1% through the year to September. Strong growth in household disposable income in the September quarter was driven by a decline in income tax payable due to the introduction of the low and middle income tax offset. The WPI grew at a faster rate than all of the selected living cost indexes over the year to the December quarter, with the pensioner and beneficiary living cost index rising by 1.8%. CPI rose by 1.8% through the year. Real household disposable income rose by 3.2% through to September 2019. Real household disposable income is calculated by deflating nominal household disposable income by the household final consumption expenditure deflator. In contrast, the real wage seasonally adjusted increased by 0.4% through the year to the December quarter. Australia's labour market remains sound, with employment growth above its long-run average and the participation rate close to a recent record high. Since September 2013, more than 1.5 million jobs have been created, and labour force participation is around record high levels. Through the year, jobs growth to January 2020 was 1.9%, stronger than the OECD average. This compares to growth of 0.7% recorded in September 2013. Employment increased by 13,500 people in January 2020 to be 247,400 persons higher over the past year. Around 239,800 jobs have been created every year on average since September 2013. Employment growth has remained consistently above the 10-year average for the past 3 years. Almost 60% of employment growth over the past year has been in full-time jobs. 2018-19 was the strongest financial year for full-time jobs growth in 11 years. Over 80% of these jobs created in 2018-2019 were full-time. The participation rate has increased to 66.1% in January 2020, remaining close to its record high of 66.2% in August 2019, compared to the 64.9% recorded in September 2013. Additionally, a record high of almost 3/4 of Australians aged between 15 and 64 have a job. More than 890,000 females have found employment since September 2013, representing 59% of the more than 1.5 million jobs created. In fact, female employment has increased by over 183,000 in the last 12 months, with more than 2/3 of these jobs being full-time. Rising female participation has driven the participation rate higher. The female participation rate was set as a record high of 61.5% in January 2020. But the good news just keeps on coming. The gender pay gap, it is a record low. Older Australians are also benefiting from stronger labour market conditions. Workforce participation for those aged 65 and over is also around a record high. The underemployment rate is the number of employed persons who want to work more hours as a share of the labour force, and it's a complementary measure of spare capacity in the labour market, in addition to the unemployment rate. Employment's forecast to expand over the forecast horizon, underpinned by a pickup in economic activity. Employment forecast to grow at 1.75% through the year to June quarter 2020 and the June quarter 2021. 1.5 million jobs have been created since the election of the coalition government in 2013. The minimum wage has increased every year since 2013 at the rate of at least 2.4%. The real minimum wage under Labor was cut twice between 2007 and 2013. A sad fact that provided even more evidence of the need for the repairs and reforms the coalition has produced, that has produced such stunning results for the